Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got in front of me today is one of the Sisters of War from the Grimdark range, available from Station Forge, and I'll make sure that all of the links for this are in the description too. She's a 3D print. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit just after the intro, and I wanted to paint something that was inspired by sort of a late 90s RTS look. So a very narrow palette and something which would be quite distinctive when it was looked at from a distance. Up close, I think she looks pretty cool. As always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So, first of all, this miniature is from the Station Forge Tribes release for March 2023. Now, it's kind of like Patreon in that you can sign up and be a member and get things much cheaper and a little bit ahead of schedule. These will be available for general release in April. And they also do physical prints from that point on. So if you don't have a printer, don't worry, you're not going to miss out if you do want to pick some of these up that are already made for you. Now, this came off of a Mars 3, a wonderful little machine, and I think the results have come out quite nicely there. Once she has been cleaned up, assembled, and ready to go, I've primed her with a spray of Zandri dust. It's a pretty good generic sort of army man color. The inspiration for this actually came from Red Alert 2, of all things. It's not going to be quite as dark as those the Soviet troopers from there, but I do like the kind of sci-fi, funky diesel punk look she's got going on. So we're going to lean into that a little bit. Now, just to make sure that there's no areas that I haven't missed with the primer, I've got a little bit of Zandri dust from the pot. I'm just going to go over the entire miniature with it. Not strictly necessary, but I do like to be quite careful with my priming, and it does sometimes leave a little bit of grey in the recesses. So it's handy just to be able to quickly flick over with a little bit of that colour from the pot, whatever it is you happen to use. Once that's dried and had time to set, I'm going to dry brush her with some Tyrant Skull. Now I am going to be fairly generous with this because I actually want the jacket to be a fair bit lighter, have a slightly yellowish tint to it. I'm also going to make sure that I get in and brighten up her skirt and trousers, just using one of my little makeup brushes as usual. And as always, remember to go across any areas of detail so that as you slowly build up that colour, you don't end up painting in your recesses. After a couple of passes to build up that colour, you'll get this. And that's quite a neat finish. I normally like having a bit of texture in my uniforms, so dry brushing, to my mind, works quite well for that. But we're not finished. What I've got here is Terminatus Stone, which is an off-white with just a little bit of sort of peachy beige warmth to it. So it fits the color profile we're already using. What I'm going to do is use this on a few of the slightly more raised areas of her jacket, just to give this a little bit more definition and to make it look slightly lighter and more faded than her trousers and the little skirt thing at the front. That is quite subtle, more so on camera, but I promise it's worth doing it in reality. What I'm going to do now is paint in her skin. What I'm going to use for this is tanned flesh from the Army Painter. I tend to find this is a little bit lighter and slightly more red than Bugman's Glow is. And for how I like to paint skin, it's a pretty good choice. It actually took me the longest time to realize that she wasn't wearing the leg wraps that most of the other Grimdark are, so yeah, don't forget her legs. Now I'm going to paint in all of the mechanical stuff, so her fists, her armor, that sort of thing. What I've got is Mephiston Red. I'm just trying to figure out where to start with this. You'll see the beautiful thing is just how well this covers over Zandri dust, which is one of the reasons why I picked that primer. So I'm using a small base brush for this, but in some areas I'm going to swap down to a layer brush to make it a little easier to reach things. But for the most part, just a quick blast of this will do the job. Now, just like that, she starts looking like a supervillain. Because the red is quite prominent on the top half of the miniature, what I want to do is to balance that out a little bit. And I'm going to paint in the trim on her skirt here, and I'm also going to paint the trim on her jacket so that instead of being very top heavy with the red, that color is continued somewhere else on the miniature. I don't want to use the same red though, so I'm going to turn to Evil Sunz Scarlet. Now this likewise will cover very well over what we've painted already. And I'm going to take the time here, slowly paint in the trim. Now as well, if she had any turnbacks on her sleeves, I would paint this in red as well. It was a little bit fiddly, and I probably wouldn't do it on a whole army, but for a sergeant or a one-off, I think that does help frame the miniature a lot more nicely. I'm going to use here some Rakarth flesh and paint in her little socks. Anything will do the job here, of course. You might choose something a little more khaki, or a Steel Legion drab or something, but grubby white socks does it for me. That'll work fine. And now with a little bit of leather brown from Vallejo, what I'm going to do is paint in her boots and her webbing. Now leather brown is quite similar to something like Thondir brown, maybe a little bit warmer, and that's what I'm quite looking forward to. That'll work well. Now I'm going to turn to Iron Hand Steel and paint in some of the metallic details. I like using Iron Hand Steel because it's a little lighter than Lead Belcher, for example. And once you've shaded it, you can leave it, or you can highlight if you fancy. So for things like buttons, for example, it's quite handy. Now I'm doing her buttons in silver because her jacket is predominantly a sort of beigey color. If I was doing her in green, I might do them brass instead, but just a little bit of contrast here to break up these shapes will look quite good. I'll also pick a few details on the backpack, just to paint these in silver too. Okay, now the last base coat that I'm going to apply is some German grey. That's another Vallejo color, very similar to Corvus black. I just want an off black for this. I'm going to use this to paint in the cables on her power fists. You could do them in metal, but I'm looking at that triangle shape to frame her because I'm also going to paint her hair in with this as well. And once that's done, you'll see what I mean by having a fairly tight palette. Red, black, and beige is really all we're doing here. Now what I'm going to do next is to shade her, and for this I'm using Vallejo Game Colors Wash. This is Umber. Now they recently changed the formulation, so if you are going to pick this one up, the one you're looking for is the one with the red little ring around it. It's the new version. I'm using this instead of Agrax Earthshade because it is a little bit lighter. It's more of a brown than a brown-black like Agrax Earthshade is. And when it dries super matte. So you'll see what I mean in about half an hour's time. I'm going to shade over everything. Be quite generous with it at first, and then once it's on, you can start shifting it around to put it where you really want it to be. Big clumps like that, keep moving it until you've got everything shaded. Once at last that's dried, you'll have something that looks like this. And the thing I really like about that umber wash is where it settles, it tends to look more kind of grimy, like collected dirt and oil and stuff like that. I really like that finish, and the really matte finish it ends with is quite handy. The very first thing I'm going to do is actually dry brush her hair. I'm going to be quite careful with this. Got a little makeup brush here, something nice and small, and I'm going to use Longbeard Grey, and not very much of it. Let's get that in shot at the right angle. Just very lightly start catching the raised bits of her hair. I don't need to do very much of this. And I could press down a little harder and give her sort of an off-white finish, but I don't want that. I just want enough to make the detail a bit more visible. Now that's nice and quick, looks pretty funky, and the other good reason of doing this first is that if I do end up with any of the Longbeard Grey on her face, well, we're about to highlight that and we'll just paint straight over the top of it. So I've got Cadian Fleshtone, and what I'm going to do is paint in most of her face and leave just the little bits of recesses of our shaded tanned flesh right in the corners. The one exception to this, the part that I'm not going to paint, is going to be her bottom lip. Then once you've blocked in most of her face, grab some Kislev flesh, and we're going to start painting in areas like her nose, her chin, and her cheekbones, which are going to be a lot easier without a camera in the way if you're painting that at home. Now, unfortunately, that fist is in just the right place to block me trying to show you how I'm painting her. The last thing I'm going to do is to finish off with some Flayed One flesh, and this is really at the point of where I'm just painting her because I'm enjoying it. It isn't necessary to go this far, But I think it looks cool, and since I'm painting it to go in my little cabinet, I'm enjoying taking the extra time here. Now, to my mind, a miniature with a face, some folks don't like painting faces. I really do. It is a skill worth practicing. I've done a couple of videos on faces in the past, and yeah, I thoroughly suggest if you're not into it, just spray up a whole bunch of faces, spare Space Marine heads or something, and have a practice. What I've got now is my patented chipping brush. This is just a bit of old packing foam folded over onto a pair of tweezers, and I'm dabbing this in some German camo black brown. You can very easily just use Rhinox hide for this one. Now I'm going to use this twice. First of all, I want to chip the armor on her fists because I want them to look like they've seen a bit of action. And also this is a much quicker way than individually painting highlights on busted fingers. Now, looking at it from here, you'll probably see a little bit more. This is going to shine just a little bit more prominently once we finish with it. What I'm going to do now is use exactly that same color again, thin it down on my brush. And what I'm going to do this time is to just try some very small, scratchy lines along the armor in a similar style, but with a lot more control over where they're going to be applied. And now to highlight that, what I have is silver. This is a Vallejo Metallic Model Air color. You can just as easily use Stormhost Silver here, but I like the way this one flows a little more. So what I'm going to do is to get in where I've painted those chips and just add little dabs of this silver to make it look like those are fresh dents and indentations. You don't have to completely fill in the brown areas either. And it will look a little different, better rather, if you don't, to be quite honest. So a little bit of chipping here and there. That can be one which is a little tricky to get your head around the first few times you do it, because it does require just a tiny bit of paint on your brush at a time. But it will work really well once you've got the hang of it. So, as always, practice is going to be key on that one. I've got some Wild Rider Red, and I'm just going to use the edge of my brush here to catch some of the extreme edges of the uniform red. Now for her leather webbing, what I've got to highlight that is Gorthor Brown. And I'm going to give you a spoiler warning here. I'm going to skip the boots entirely because I'm actually going to, when I base this, pretty much cover a good half or so of the boots. So I'm not going to bother putting the work into them now. Now, if I was planning on highlighting the jacket and the skirt or anything any further, what I would do would be to grab some Screaming Skull and use that to paint some small straight lines. I'm not going to though, because I think that's come out pretty much how I'd like. I don't think we're going to add much more to it with those highlights. What I have got is White Scar, and I'm just going to very carefully paint in the lenses, and if I leave a little bit of the dark section around the outside, not to worry. I don't need to fill these in completely white. What I'm going to do now is pick a color which is going to stand out super sharp on the goggles so that it's really going to be quite different to everything else we've put on so far. You could use a blue if you fancy, but I'm using Warp Lightning Contrast because just as quick as that, I've got little glowing goggles on her head. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead, pop a matte varnish over her and put her base on. I'll include the recipes for those in the description. Let's get a look at what she looks like. And she is all finished. And there at last, our Grimguard Sister of War is complete. And I'm really pleased with the result. She was just a lot of fun to paint. It's worth pointing out that the kit does come with a variety of pistol arms and other things like that, so she doesn't necessarily have to have the twin power fists. But I'm not too fussed about what she's useful for on the table, and that pose, it's just funky. It's a lot of fun. So as always, thank you very much to Exit23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Rod, Jimmy, and Andrew. Your support means the world, folks, and lets me keep buying resin. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.